Venezuela's oil shock, what the petrodollar system really is. Venezuela is one of those names that can make oil traders sit up straight. Not because it always produces the most barrels, not because it always exports on schedule, but because Venezuela sits on a kind of crude oil the world can't easily replace. Venezuela's oil becomes a geopolitical question. Markets start to remember something deeper. That deeper thing is not oil prices, not even sanctions. It's the invisible system that sits underneath modern history, the system that links oil, money, and power, the petrodollar. And to understand what the petrodollar really is, you have to unlearn the meme version of it, because the petrodollar is not a single treaty. It's not a magical switch that turns the dollar on or off. The petrodollar is a set of incentives, institutions, and habits built over decades that turned one commodity into a currency engine. In the simplest terms, it works like this. Oil is traded globally. Oil needs a common unit to price and settle payments. For decades, that unit has overwhelmingly been the US dollar. Because when the world needs dollars to buy oil, the world needs access to the dollar system. And when the world needs access to the dollar system, the United States gains a kind of quiet leverage, the power to influence trade, credit, and liquidity far beyond its borders. This is why, when oil shocks happen, the story is never just about energy. It's also about money. And when Venezuela becomes the headline, whether through disruption, sanctions, or political rupture, the question beneath the question is always the same. If you like documentaries that explain the hidden mechanics behind history, oil, money, and power, subscribe now. This channel is built for long-form system-level stories like this. I produce these documentaries myself, research, writing, and the final cut. What happens to the dollar system when the oil system trembles? But before we get to Venezuela, we need to go back to the moment the modern money system broke and then rebuilt itself around oil. Because the petrodollar wasn't born from strength. It was born from a crisis. In the decades after World War II, the United States sat at the center of a new global order. Under Bretton Woods, the dollar became the anchor currency. Other currencies were tied to it. And the dollar itself was tied, at least in theory, to gold. It was a compromise that worked as long as trust held. But by the late 1960s and early 1970s, trust was cracking. The United States was running large deficits. Dollars were flowing overseas. And foreign governments began doing something that terrified policymakers in Washington. They started asking for gold. Then came the break in 1971. The United States ended the convertibility of dollars into gold, a moment many historians treat as the true end of the Bretton Woods era. A world built on a gold-backed anchor suddenly had a floating paper anchor, and paper anchors require something else to hold them down. Demand, habit, need. The question, in plain language, became, why should the world keep needing dollars? Only a few years later, history offered an answer, not in a conference room, but in an oil shock. In 1973, an oil embargo and production cuts shook the global economy. Prices surged, shortages spread. The world discovered how fragile modern life was when the energy tap tightened. And in that chaos, something important happened. Oil became not just a commodity, but the most strategic commodity on earth. If the world could be brought to its knees by the price of oil, then whoever stabilized oil flows, priced the oil consistently, and controlled the financial channels around the oil would shape the future. This is the environment where the petrodollar system took form. Not as a single signed document you can point to, but as a pattern, oil priced in dollars, oil revenues recycled into dollar assets funding the US system and reinforcing the dollar's central role. It's a loopy, and loops are powerful because they don't need a dictator. They need momentum. Here's how the loop works in slow motion. Step 1. Oil exports generate massive revenues for producing states. Those revenues arrive largely as dollars because the global system is built to settle energy trade through dollar channels. Step 2. Those dollars don't just sit idle. They are stored, invested, and recycled, often into us. Treasuries and dollar-based financial assets, because those markets are deep, liquid, and globally accepted. Step 3. That recycling increases demand for dollar assets, which supports the dollar's global role and helps the US finance itself at scale. And the step before, because the dollar remains central, the world continues to use it, reinforcing step one. That is the petrodollar in its purest form, a self-reinforcing relationship between global energy trade and the dollar-based financial system. Now, here's what people get wrong. They imagine a world where the petrodollar ends and the dollar instantly collapses. Reality is more subtle. The petrodollar is not a light switch. It's an ecosystem. And ecosystems change slowly until they don't. So the real question isn't, is the petrodollar dead? The real question is, are the incentives that sustain it weakening? Because if they are, you don't see a collapse first. You see leaks, workarounds, new settlement channels, more bilateral deals, more currency diversification, and eventually, if the leaks become large enough, the loop becomes harder to sustain. Which brings us to the modern era, where oil is still strategic, but finance has become even more strategic. Because today, control isn't just about ships and pipelines. It's about payment rails, clearing systems, sanctions regimes, access to liquidity. I'm curious, do you think we're moving toward one dominant system or a fragmented world with parallel payment rails? Comment. One system or parallel rails, and why? In other words, it's about the financial plumbing behind the petrodollar loop. And this is where Venezuela matters. Venezuela is not just an oil producer. It is a petrostate, a country whose political stability, currency stability, and social stability have all been tied for decades to oil revenues. When oil money flows smoothly, a petrostate can maintain order even with deep structural weaknesses. When oil money breaks, everything downstream begins to fracture: the currency, imports, inflation, public services, and legitimacy. But Venezuela also matters for a second reason. It sits at the intersection of oil and sanctions, the intersection of commodity flows, and dollar-based enforcement. In the modern world, sanctions are not just economic punishment. They are a test of system control, because the most powerful sanctions are not the ones that stop barrels from leaving a port. They are the ones that make it hard to get paid, hard to insure ships, hard to clear transactions, hard to access dollars, hard to participate in the loop. So if you want to understand Venezuela's oil shock, you have to see it as more than a supply story. It is a stress test of the petrodollar ecosystem and of the larger question: who controls the channels through which oil turns into money? In the next part, we're going to dissect the system like a machine. What exactly is priced in dollars? And why? What role do U.S. treasuries play? And why do oil producers often end up financing the very system that polices them? Start with the most basic reality of global trade. A commodity is only as useful as the system that lets you buy it, ship it, insure it, and pay for it. Oil is the most traded strategic commodity on Earth, and for decades, the default language of that trade has been the US dollar. This creates a permanent global need. If you import oil, you need dollars. If you want dollars, you need access to the dollar system. That means banks, correspondent banking, clearing, dollar liquidity, and often our relationship with institutions that sit under US jurisdiction or influence. This is the part most people ignore. They focus on pricing, but pricing is just a label on the outside. The real power sits inside settlement, because settlement is where money becomes real. Now, why did the dollar become the default settlement currency for oil in the first place? Part of the answer is historical momentum. After World War II, the US economy was dominant. The financial system was deep, and the dollar became the primary reserve currency. But another part of the answer is stability. A global commodity needs a stable unit. Not perfect, just stable enough to be usable at scale. And for decades, the dollar offered three things no other currency could match at the same time: liquidity, convertibility, and the deepest government bond market on Earth. This is where US treasuries enter the story not as politics, but as infrastructure. Oil producers accumulate large dollar revenues. Those revenues have to go somewhere. A country that suddenly receives tens of billions of dollars in export earnings does not want that money sitting in cash, exposed to inflation, bank risk, or political risk. It needs a place to park it. And US treasuries have historically been the most convenient parking lot. Deep market, easy to buy and sell, widely accepted as collateral. Oil revenues denominated in dollars are recycled back into dollar assets, including treasuries. And that recycling matters because it helps sustain demand for US debt, which supports US borrowing capacity and reinforces the dollar's role. Now, pause and really look at what that means. The system that buys oil often ends up being financed by oil. That is not conspiracy. That is structure. Quick question: when you hear petrodollar, what do you think it actually means? Drop your definition in the comments, even if it's just one sentence. A structure built on incentives. If you sell oil in dollars, you accumulate dollars. If you accumulate dollars, you need dollar assets. If you need dollar assets, you buy treasuries. And if you buy treasuries, you help sustain the system that keeps the dollar central. But there's a second layer here, a layer that turns the petrodollar from finance into power. Because the same infrastructure that makes the dollar liquid also makes it enforceable. In a dollar-centered system, the gatekeepers are not only oil producers, they're also banks, payment rails, and clearing networks. When a country is sanctioned, it doesn't merely lose access to trade, it loses access to settlement. It may still sell oil, but it's forced into discounts, intermediaries, shadow shipping, complex barter, or alternative payment routes, which is another way of saying it is pushed to the edges of the system. So the petrodollar is not simply oil priced in dollars, it's oil priced in dollars, plus oil settled through dollar infrastructure, plus oil revenues reinvested into dollar markets, plus enforcement capability through financial rails. If you step back from the daily noise, you'll notice something chilling about modern power. It is increasingly exercised without tanks in the streets. It is exercised through permission to transact, permission to clear, permission to insure, permission to borrow, permission to access dollars. This is what a financial playbook looks like in the 21st century. Now, Venezuela is a near-perfect case study for why this playbook is so powerful. Venezuela's economy has long been shaped by oil dependence, and its political stability has been repeatedly tested by oil volatility and external pressure. But what turns Venezuela into a petrodollar story is not the oil alone. It's the question of access. Access to buyers, access to shipping, access to payment, settlement. And when access is disrupted, the result is not just lost revenue. It is a breakdown of the state's basic ability to function, because in a petrostate, oil revenue is not a bonus. It is the bloodstream. Now, here's the crucial point. Even if the petrodollar ecosystem is slowly changing, the playbook still works because the dollar system remains central to settlement. That is why so many geopolitical conflicts appear on the surface to be about territory, but underneath they are about channels. Channels of trade, channels of money, channels of settlement. And in early January 2026, the world watched Venezuela re-enter the center of this storm. After a US military operation captured Venezuela's president and triggered international condemnation and uncertainty over governance and control. Regardless of how any viewer feels about the politics, the system level takeaway is clear. The question mark it's instantly asked is not only what happens to Venezuela, it's what happens to Venezuela's oil flows and under what rules. Because when the rules change, the petrodollar loop feels it. If oil flows are redirected, settlement patterns shift. If sanctions tighten, payment routes shrink. If control becomes uncertain, risk premiums rise. This is why you can have an oil shock even before production drops. The shock can be informational. A sudden change in who controls exports, contracts, shipping permissions, and payment channels can move expectations, and expectations move price. So let's land this with precision. What is the petrodollar system really? It is not a single deal you can cancel. It is not a law of physics. It is not a guarantee that the dollar will rule forever. The petrodollar system is a network effect built on three pillars. First, the dollar's role as the default unit of settlement for strategic commodities, especially oil. Second, the recycling of oil revenues into dollar assets, especially highly liquid. Government debt, which reinforces the dollar's financial gravity. Third, the enforcement power that comes from controlling key rails of settlement, clearing, and liquidity, which makes access to the system a strategic privilege. Now, Where does Venezuela's oil shock fit into this? Venezuela is a reminder that oil is not just energy, it is leverage. It is a reminder that the world's most strategic commodity still flows through a system, and that the system can be tightened, redirected, or disrupted. In January 2026, global attention snapped back to Venezuela after the U.S. capture of the country's president and statements indicating the U.S. intended to temporarily control Venezuela during a transition, the development that triggered international backlash and raised immediate questions about continuity, stability, and exports. Even if the barrels keep moving, the rules around those barrels can change. And when the rules change, the real shock isn't only the price of oil. It's the cost of certainty, because the petrodollar loop relies on trust in contracts, trust in settlement, trust in the safety of parking reserves, trust in the reliability of the rails. When trust is high, the system feels invisible. When trust cracks, the system becomes a story. And one more. What would you watch to measure this in real life? Oil pricing, settlement, currency, reserves, sanctions, or shipping. Pick one indicator and tell me your reasoning. And above all, watch the simplest truth at the center of it all. Money is not only printed, it is demanded, and for decades, oil has been one of the engines of that demand. That is what the petrodollar system really is. Not a myth, not a slogan, a mechanism. And once you see the mechanism, you start to recognize it everywhere. In sanctions, in crises, in trade wars, and in the sudden moments when the world remembers that the price of oil is never just about oil, it is about the system underneath history. If you want more documentaries like this, subscribe. Next, we can break down the sanctions playbook in detail. SWIFT, insurance, shipping, and the banking rails that decide what access really means. Until then, keep watching the system, not just the headlines.